And that's why the kitchen can be such a beautiful place. Because when we'd rather not engage, when we're playing a little passive aggressive or trying to employ that great strategy, the silent treatment, the kitchen always gets in the way. Because I may not want to talk, but I still want a sandwich. And it's not easy to work your way around the kitchen while not making eye contact with the other person as you essentially pretend that you don't notice them standing there while you reach for the mustard. Hey everyone, and welcome to week 3 of our series all about having healthy, happy relationships. In week 1, we talked about model God, and Ken encouraged us to ask 2 different questions. The first was, what does it mean for you to see yourself as being created in the image of God? And what does it mean for you to see others as being created in the image of God? Then in week 2, Ken talked about think, serve, and how we want to have the posture and the mindset of service in all of our relationships. And today, we're talking about another key that is the foundation of every healthy relationship, and that is communication. Now, when we talk about communication, there is so much to talk about because the topic is so broad, because it's generally just about the transfer of information from one place to another. And so today, we could talk about the principle of communication and oratory, but unless you have a big presentation coming up, you'll all be really kind of bored out of your minds. So instead, I want to focus on the importance of communication in the context of our most important relationships. Communication with the people that we're with all the time, the people that we care about the most. Because in these relationships, we're not just sharing information, we're sharing information about ourselves, information about who we are. And so communication becomes about so much more than just information. Communication is the process by which I understand and am understood. Communication is how I come to know others and am known by others. And whether or not we do this well determines the strength and health of our relationships. And so today, I'm in my kitchen. Because when I think about communication, I think about the kitchen. The kitchen is like the heart of the home. It's where so much communication takes place with the people that we care about the most. There is the bustling morning routine where everyone is moving and getting ready for the day ahead. There's the lunchtime connect that is usually a bit more informal. There's the more formal dinner table where we talk about our days and we share our lives with our friends and our family. The kitchen is where the nightly homework happens that can branch off into talks about God and life and purpose and meaning. The kitchen is where the bills are paid, where financial decisions are made, where vacations are planned. The kitchen is where the coffee is. I can't even begin to number how many important conversations I've had with my friends over coffee in one of our kitchens. Come to think of it, some of the biggest decisions that I've made in my life have been made in a kitchen. I've imparted some of my greatest wisdom in our kitchen, and I've also put my foot in my mouth with a simple "what's for dinner" in the kitchen. The cooking, the cleaning, dancing, laughing, crying, they all happen in the kitchen. My kids have said that they love me in the kitchen, and they've also told me that they hate me in the kitchen. Even my communication with God often happens in the kitchen, as my day often begins and ends over a bowl of cereal in the kitchen, talking to God. The kitchen is where so many fights happen. I feel like every fight I've ever had in my marriage has happened in the kitchen. There's just something about the communication that happens in the kitchen. The kitchen feels like real life. It's where stuff's going on and it's not always clean like this, and we're not staring into each other's eyes like some kind of romantic comedy. No, there are dishes to do, and there's kids to feed, and there's decisions to make and schedules to align. The kitchen is where I find myself most often communicating with the people that I love the most in real life. And when it comes to communication, there really are 2 parts in a relationship. There is the receiving and the sending, the talking and the listening. And we have to do both well to have healthy relationships. So first, the listening. It's in the kitchen where I first discovered the wisdom of a skill that I learned in pre-marriage counseling. and where I still practice it as often as I think to. And this skill is called active listening. Active listening is, first of all, listening, which in itself is becoming a lost art in our culture. Because think about it, how often does someone start talking and your first thoughts are, oh, I already know where this is going, or I've heard this before, or you just start thinking about how you're going to respond to what they're saying. Active listening is where we resist doing any of these. It's a posture that says, I don't want to assume anything. I want to give you my full attention, my full energy, so that I make sure I fully understand and receive what you're trying to communicate to me. And I'm going to resist coming up with solutions or critiques. I just want to listen well. And no, active listening cannot be done with a cell phone in your hands. And this posture of listening well is something that we find emphasized over and over in the scriptures. In the wisdom literature of the Proverbs, we find this line, if one gives an answer before he hears, it is his folly and shame. Or there's James' famous line that we should be quick to listen and slow to speak, both of which remind us that it is wise to be good listeners. And then there are just like the accounts of Jesus' life in the Gospels. Isn't it amazing to think that Jesus didn't come and just give sermons? He actually walked with us and he listened to us. I mean, can you imagine Jesus, the one by whom and through whom all things were made and all things hold together, intently listening to you talk about what you're struggling with, what you're feeling? Can you imagine how he would make you feel? And why did he listen to us? Because he loves us. Because he came to serve us. And so I see listening as something that we should want to get better at as we practice bringing the love of Jesus to those around us. Paul says the same thing in Philippians chapter 2 as he encourages us to be like Jesus. He writes, in humility, count others more significant than yourselves. Let each of you look not only to his own interests, but also to the interests of others. So back to this idea, the skill of active listening. I say I discovered it or rediscovered it because at first, when I learned it, I thought it was like a bit of a joke. And when you first hear about it, it's going to be easy for you to think that you're too good for it. But the way that I first learned it was in a pastor's office in pre-marriage counseling. And the exercise was to practice rephrasing what the other person had said. So for instance, my wife would express how she wanted us to have more dedicated time praying together because she wanted us to be encouraging one another in our discipleship to Jesus. And then it was my job not to agree or disagree or come up with a plan, but simply to rephrase what she had just said and then ask, is that right? In other words, to say, did I hear you correctly? It is a painful exercise to do in front of someone else. And at the time I thought, what kind of morons find this helpful? But what I've learned is that when you're dealing with real life issues that really matter, and emotions are high and you're experiencing frustration with someone else or confusion, or you feel like neither of you are being heard, or you're just having the same conversation over and over and over, or when you're listening to a friend explain a hole that they're in, or a mistake that they've made, or a big decision that they're trying to make, or they're expressing their grief over something or someone. It's in those moments that this simple skill is an amazing tool. It's an amazing tool in marriage, in friendships, and even with your kids. I found with our kids, especially during COVID, it's easy to get into routines and maintenance mode and assume that we know what they're thinking because we're bigger than them and we're smarter than them, right? But recently we had a bit of an eye-opener. One of our kids made us a Christmas card at school, and inside it wrote, "Merry Christmas, I love you, ... COVID has been really hard." My wife and I read it and immediately realized this was new information. Our kids are young and we thought they barely noticed COVID, but maybe the truth was that we hadn't spent enough time actually listening to them. And so for us, this was a great moment to break out those active listening skills that we learned all the way back in premarital counseling. It's such an important skill or mindset for us to put on because so much of poor communication comes from bad assumptions. There's a story I read this week on a blog about a couple going out for a special dinner date night to celebrate their birthdays that were close together. And the wife had planned for a group of friends to meet them for a surprise party for her husband at his favorite Chinese restaurant. As they drove away, the husband suggested, "Let's go out for Mexican food." His wife calmly said, "I'd really prefer Chinese food tonight." The husband came back, "No, I'd really like a big enchilada." And then they went back and forth, and it became obvious to the wife that he had chosen to be demanding and unreasonable. and that he was interested only in his own food cravings. Finally, she screamed at her husband in frustration, "You dope! I have a surprise party planned for you at the Chinese restaurant. We have to go there." To her even greater frustration, the husband burst out laughing, which made her even angrier. He laughed so hard that it took him 5 minutes to tell her that he had planned a surprise party for her at the Mexican restaurant. And this story shows how important good communication is for healthy relationships. Before the wife knew the truth, she thought that her husband was just being selfish and difficult. He probably thought the same thing about her. But actually, both of them were being motivated not by selfishness, but by love. The lesson being this, that life is complex, and you can't assume that you know the motive or inner workings of the other person. So I encourage you to try it, especially the paraphrasing part. It's really simple. Just resist the urge to do anything but listen, and then restate back to them what they already said in your own words. So they talk, and then you say, "What I hear you saying is blank. Is that right?" And don't add, like if they say, "I'm feeling tired from all the housework," or "I feel like I'm carrying this relationship," don't guess and say, "So you're saying I'm lazy? You don't think that I care?" Because that may not actually be what they're saying. And if it is what they're saying, then let them say it. And then just pause before responding. Give it a try. Focus on being a better listener and see how it changes your relationships for the better. The first part of good communication is listening. The second part is talking. And when I say talking, I really mean all of the ways, verbal and nonverbal, that we convey what we're thinking and feeling. But when it comes to talking, I think it's important to begin with this, that we have to recognize the power that words have. In the scriptures, we find that words can build up and words can tear down. In the Proverbs, we find proverbs like this: "Death and life are in the power of the tongue. Gentle words are like a tree of life, but a deceitful tongue crushes the spirit. There is one whose rash words are like sword thrusts, but the tongue of the wise brings healing." And then Paul writes to the church in Ephesus, "Let no corrupting talk come out of your mouths, but only such as is good for building up, as fits the occasion, that it may give grace to those who hear." All of these passages emphasize the power of words and their power to build up or to tear down. Because words can be stores of treasure that we carry around with us for a long time, or they can begin negative loops in our minds that shape how we see ourselves for years and years. So when we talk about talking, I think it's important to begin here, because when we begin here, we realize how careful we should be with what we say. Our words should be measured and always motivated by our desire to build up and to love the other person who we're speaking to. And hey, this isn't easy. I remember one time we got this new kitchen, and I was noticing that in this new kitchen that the counters were beginning to be, not wiped down the way that I would imagine that we would wipe our counters in our beautiful new kitchen. And I knew that bringing this up to my wife would be a bit of a difficult thing to bring this up, because I felt like it was her job, I guess, to be wiping down the counters better. And so I actually thought about this. I thought about how should I bring this up to my wife in a way that would be constructive and would have the result that I was looking for. And so I'm not joking, but I actually thought about this, and then I delivered these lines to my wife one evening while we were sitting on opposite ends of the island. I said to her, "So have we just stopped wiping up the counters?" Now I know you're probably laughing that you're like, you really can't, you thought about that and that's what you came up with. But I really thought at the time, this will be maybe a good way to bring up this subject. And I won't tell you what my wife said, but let me just say it this way, that she communicated to me that my attempt to communicate with her had failed. And since then, we've mutually decided that it will be my job to make sure that the counters are wiped up to the quality and standards of our home. Now, luckily, that moment has become a bit of a joke between us about my terrible attempt to communicate. But I share it because even in our best attempts, we can fail miserably to communicate what we want to communicate. But just because it's hard doesn't mean that we should give up. In fact, some of you, if you're like me, hate to talk about your feelings. I take I said my I do's and my till death do us part, and I'll let you know if anything changes. My wife, on the other hand, wants to communicate about everything, immediately, including her most recent dreams. I remember early in our marriage, I didn't want to talk about something that she wanted to talk about. And so she pulled out this great line. She said, "We can't go to bed without resolving this. I just don't want to end up a statistic." And that's why the kitchen can be such a beautiful place. Because when we'd rather not engage, when we're playing a little passive aggressive or trying to employ that great strategy, the silent treatment, that genius communication technique of doing nothing and hoping that it all just goes away, the kitchen always gets in the way. Because I may not want to talk, but I still want a sandwich. And it's not easy to work your way around the kitchen while not making eye contact with the other person as you essentially pretend that you don't notice them standing there while you reach for the mustard. Communication, talking, it's hard. It requires repetition and intentionality. But at the core, if we really want to have healthy relationships where we are fully known, we have to be willing not only to talk, but to be vulnerable. Because the goal of communication in a relationship is to know the other person and be known by them. But if we're not vulnerable, then the other person isn't actually getting to know us. And so much of our communication these days tends to avoid vulnerability. It tends to be masked. And what I mean by masked is that we're not really being vulnerable. We're posturing and attempting to project that we've got it all together, we've got it all under control, and that we're not actually a little bit screwed up inside. So much of our communication is an attempt to hide the truth that is so hard to admit, even to ourselves, that truly we are broken and afraid and confused sometimes and ashamed sometimes. And that's why we consciously and subconsciously will do everything to hide that truth from other people. And if we do a good enough job, we can even convince ourselves. We're afraid that if anyone ever really got to know what we're really thinking, what we really feel, that they would find us unlovable. I mean, if I say I'm struggling, I'm hurting, I need help, I think I might be depressed, I'm unhappy, will anyone be up for listening to me? Will anyone stick around for that? But if we don't learn this, to be vulnerable, we will never truly be known. And we will miss out on true relationship and the wonderful experience of love. That moment when you reveal everything that there is to know about yourself and the other person is still standing there with open arms, accepting you. And you may be thinking, well, great, but how do I even get to that place where I can do that, where I can be vulnerable? I think it comes from being grounded in the reality that we have already been deemed valuable and accepted by our loving Heavenly Father. And when we can live there, then we can truly be vulnerable, because the other person's rejection will no longer destroy us. Sure, it'll hurt, but it's not the final word. Relationships, healthy, happy relationships require good communication. It requires active listening, gentleness, encouraging words, and vulnerability as we express the most intimate parts of who we are. And you can do it. The only question is, do you really want to have real relationships? To know and be known? Or do you think you just know everything already? Would you rather not be troubled by having to listen to other people and having to be careful with your words? Perhaps you envision an ideal world where people just do as you say and nobody gets to know the real you. And you can certainly decide to live like that. But I'll tell you this, that eventually you will find yourself alone and feeling unloved. And for as hard as it is to listen and as hard as it is to be vulnerable, it is far worse to be alone and unloved. But life is so much better when we're together, when we're known and loved and accepted just as we are. And so I invite you to think about the kitchens that you find yourself in, with your partner, with your kids, with your parents, with your family members, your friends, your coworkers, and your neighbors, and ask, do I listen and talk in such a way that I am communicating a deep desire to know them and to be known by them?
Hi, everybody. It's Ken and Pete, and we're really excited to be here this morning. We're live. We're at our Kitchener campus, and it's an opportunity for you to react with us. And here's the text number, 226-214-2793. Now, this is really helpful for us because, Pete, you did a great job talking about listening and talking and all that sort of stuff.
Thanks.
And we're in this weird spot. I don't know if you guys think about this much, but we're doing a lot of talking, and we aren't able to listen because you're not being able to talk to us back again. And the whole dynamic that we're going through with COVID right now makes that a bit of a challenge for us. But we're really, really happy that we get to do this thing together today, and we believe that this is helpful in so many ways. We can't see your facial expressions, unfortunately. We can't pick up your tone of voice through this medium.
Yeah.
But it's a great opportunity for us as well. And that's kind of important, isn't it? That side of it.
It's a weird medium in many ways. It's also strange. You may not think about this, but from our perspective, like we're looking at questions coming in here while we try to hear each other and think also what we're going to say. And so it's a very strange. This is not really maybe the greatest example of what great communication looks like.
No, exactly. Yeah.
But we were just trying to provide some valuable content to you maybe.
Yeah.
But the idea of the medium being important, it was something that I had in my notes and it didn't make it into the sermon. And so think through, if you want to be intentional about your communication, I think it's important to think through what medium you're going to use and what medium is the best for what you want to communicate. So when I say medium, maybe you're not familiar with that language, but I think about texting, a written letter, an email, a Zoom call, a face-to-face kind of thing, more than one person in the room. And each of those mediums, I think, have a strength and a weakness to them.
Yes.
And so if you feel like maybe someone isn't hearing you, maybe when you're in person with them, it doesn't feel like they're really hearing you. Maybe writing a letter is actually a good way to get them to hear you. Engaging in conflict over social media, probably not
a good idea.
The most helpful.
No.
Although
even a very popular sport.
Yeah, it's very popular right now. Yes.
Yeah.
Texting in conflict kind of thing. I try to keep my texting to only just planning something. So let's make plans on when we're going to meet or be in touch. Yeah. But anytime it takes a turn into like, this seems like it's getting heavier or it's really important stuff, then I'm like hitting that call button and talk to someone.
Well, I've had times when I've gotten kind of worked up and I've typed up something and I pushed the send button. And I remember before when all my stuff was plugged in, now I'm going obviously wireless. I can remember going, oh, nuts, I shouldn't have sent that. And I run over and try and unplug it. And maybe you've had that experience too, where you've shared something in a medium that really you shouldn't have. You got worked up and instead of, you responded to that and it was just not a good thing. And then you had to go, oh, I'm so sorry. I didn't mean for you to do this or to hear that and so on and so forth. And that's a challenge for sure.
For sure. We had another question come in that I didn't think about this angle, but I think it's a great theme to pick up on and connect to this message is the topic of evangelism and where active listening can connect to evangelism. And so I was thinking this through of like, if you want to share your faith with someone else, it's so important that you don't begin with, oh, I have so much that I want to unload on you, but you begin with listening for the reason that you want to communicate that you care about them.
Yeah.
And not just communicate that you care. You want to actually care about them. And so what's most important is that I learn, where are you? Who are you? Before I really have anything to say.
That is so important. And I think that's absolutely bang on. I think the whole idea of understanding where a person's coming from is so critical, and it helps you to learn. Part of the problem is that we'll tend to think, well, and there's a label on that particular belief system or whatever. I'm an atheist, I'm a Muslim, whatever it may be. But actually, inside the boundaries of that, they may have a unique perspective, and you need to hear it. You need to hear the struggles. And I think for the longest, we should be first listeners, okay, even in evangelism. And then we should be talkers. And I think it's really important to start there. Yeah, for sure.
You find that through the interactions of Jesus and in the book of Acts, the starting places are different. And the tactic, I don't really like that word, but the tact that you take in the conversation, we find lots of examples.
Absolutely. Yeah, good point.
Another question that I wish, I get these questions and I think I should have put that in the sermon.
Yeah,
so
exactly.
Another one is in the online space. So we're all in the Zoom world right now, and I didn't even throw that into the sermon, but how to practice active listening in the Zoom space. So a couple things that I've thought of just in all the meetings that we have in the church world is I know that it's a practice to turn off your camera so that you don't see yourself, which I think can be helpful in some ways. But I found that early on, having my camera on and looking at myself was helpful because I didn't realize what my resting face looked like. and I realized that my resting face did not communicate active listening.
Okay,
Like
good
it was
point.
kind of like a dead face. And if someone else was looking at that, they'd be like, Pete is not paying attention.
Yeah,
And so I
exactly.
found that at least in the beginning to look at myself and be like, what is the face that communicates I'm fully present, I'm listening? And I find that like nodding, like moving, like yep, and just giving people those little verbal cues. And
then you got that little button down below where you can push reactions, and they've expanded that a little bit, and I'm sure it'll get bigger and bigger, but you can throw those up, which is kind of a cool thing. Here's a thumbs up, here's an applause, or here's a heart, or whatever the case might be. Yeah, I think that's all part of the deal for sure.
Yeah. What else do we have here as far as questions? We had a great one come in. Where did it go?
While you're looking,
go ahead.
I'm reminded of first of James chapter 1 verse 19, which I think is so appropriate and relates extremely well to what you were saying. And by the way, before I forget, I want to talk about the kitchen that you focused on, the kitchen in your talk. Obviously, you were standing in your kitchen.
Yeah.
But I think it's bang on that some of the greatest conversations and some of the most intimate experiences that we have are in our kitchens. And sometimes we take that even into a cafe, so we're sort of taking the kitchen motif and bringing it to bear in that particular context around a coffee or whatever the case might be. And I know in my own home that our kitchen has been just some great experiences there, some tense experiences there, some theological studies or conversations there, some openness, how are your dreams, how's your life going, how's your day been? Those are all really cool.
Yeah.
But when you get to James chapter 1, verse 19, we read, my dear brothers and sisters. So this is Jesus' half-brother writing. My dear brothers and sisters, take note of this. Everyone should be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to become angry. And you talked about this, but the quick to listen piece, if I'm not quick to listen and if I'm not slow to speak, I'm wondering if anger can become a fruit of that. If that's why it's in the passage, and I think that that's something to really, you misunderstand people. You're loading your gun before you're actually listening to them, and I think it's really critical that we elevate listening. That listening becomes sort of how am I going to move into this conversation where listening is going to become my priority, and that's a habit that we have to probably work at developing. But I think it's so critical, so important.
Yeah, and one thing that you could practice is to just be disciplined to not feel the cultural imperative that when the other person's done speaking, that you have to have something ready to say. I think there's something in our culture where we feel that, right? Like even a moment ago, we had a bit of dead space where I was looking for a question, and we probably felt like, we're a bit awkward. And maybe you felt a little bit awkward. That's a weird thing that we have in our culture, that we can't just go, let's think.
Yeah.
And so maybe just practice when someone else is speaking that I will give a 20-second pause before I give an answer to someone.
Well, you were talking at the first service about that culture, right?
Yeah, there's a culture. I can't remember which one it was, but I heard someone shared a story with me once about a culture where that was normal. And so the pause was normal. And whenever people from our culture interacted with people from their culture, they felt like the other culture was being dismissive or rude even. And it caused like a bit of a clash. But I thought that would be a great thing to build in, especially in your most important relationships, that it's okay and it's normal and it's actually a sign of caring for the other person. I'm going to pause because while you were talking, I wasn't loading, I was listening.
Yeah.
There you go. There's a preacher like, don't be loading, be listening.
Yeah,
there.
exactly.
Right.
Well, I think the other line that you had mentioned, which I think is so critical, is this: I want to be known and I want to know. And the only way the key way for that to happen is obviously listening and talking. I can't know someone else unless I don't listen to them, and I can't be known by someone else unless I open up my heart and share. And I think those are both so important for us, right? I mean, there's a deep, deep passion inside of us that says, I want to know and I want to be known, and I think that's critical. And that's where communication is so important, so key, right?
Right. It brings us to love, which is the ultimate expression and experience that we all want to have. A lot of the questions that we've gotten in today have to do with people that are eager, I think, to have this experience of active listening. Like they seem to be talking about how they want to, or they've tried this, but they have, it seems as though they're in relationships where the other person is not as eager.
Right.
And so they're either the passive person, or they're not wanting to share their feelings, or they kind of give them silence. So we've been thinking a little bit this morning about how do you help open someone up? And so one of the things that I thought was that, back to the cultural thing, I think our culture not only is bad at listening, but we've also kind of taught to not share our feelings. Like it's kind of normal that like, we all wear masks, and that's normal. And so if you're in a relationship with someone who doesn't naturally share and open up, rather than getting frustrated with them, like, why won't you open up to me? Realize like, okay, this is actually something that's been like conditioned over many years of their life. And so as someone who loves that other person, I'm going to try to slowly, patiently teach them what it means to be in a relationship where we're vulnerable. And that may take many, many years. And you may get like a little pebble here and there. You're like, oh, they opened up just a little bit. But that's part of what it means to love the other person.
Yeah, I think there can be some real value too for the people in your circle of relationship, whatever that might be, a friend, family, spouse,
Life
kids,
group,
to actually talk about talking. Let's communicate about communicating. Let's talk. How do you want me to communicate to you? What are some struggles that maybe you're feeling from me? Am I talking too fast? Am I not opening up? Am I quick to judge? And helping each other communicate better, I think, is a key to helping us be healthier in our communication. And we think it's all a natural, normal thing, but a lot of us need to learn to do it better. And I think learning to listen is really, really big, really, really key. And very, very important.
Yeah, and I think if we want to emulate what Jesus was like, I said this in the first service, but I love the idea. I love imagining Jesus listening to us, and I love imagining those scenes in the Gospels where Jesus would have healed multitudes of people. And I think, well, if there was 1,000 people that he healed, what did that look like? And so I imagine a lineup. And as each person comes up to Jesus, he doesn't just go, don't tell me.
Yeah.
Don't tell me, I know what's wrong with you. I imagine it more of like, hey, Jesus, like my arm hurts.
Yeah.
I've been like, there's something wrong with my brain. And Jesus was like, tell me about that. Like, I care about you. I want to hear about this. And then he healed them.
Yeah.
And I know it doesn't say that. It doesn't say that that's how it worked out in the gospel, but I imagine it that way, that likely there was this dialogue. And we're told over and over throughout the Bible how God listens to us. So I think that we have good ground to stand on there. But just this idea of like a God who listens. And so when we're actively listening, we're actually imaging God to other people. And so to be an active listener is showing people this is what God is like as well. And maybe you could flip that and be like, that's why we pray.
Yeah.
Like,
Exactly. Exactly. I know in my own life, if I look back at some of my painful experiences in life, I can think about, breaking my leg twice. I can think about losing a job, getting fired from a job. I can think about friendships that have broken up and so on. And yet in the midst of all of that, I think that the communication, the words that have been spoken to me are among the most painful things I've experienced and also the most blessed things that I've experienced, which is a great reminder of the power of words. Words are very, very powerful, and God's given us this opportunity to use them, to leverage them in people's lives for good, but the potential there is also for hurt and harm. And we need to be really careful. And I'm sure some of you are thinking right now about something someone said to you that caused great pain in your life, and those words keep, echoing in your mind. May have happened a couple of decades ago. But I think there's also, if you think about it, there's those powerful positive words. I love you. You matter to me. Those are really important. And it's really critical for us to not just think about what someone has done to us with both those negative and positives, but then to ask ourselves, how can I now use the words that God has given to me, the power of speech, the power of communication for God's glory and the good of other people? And I think that's so important. So
and the language in Scripture is often of building or bringing life and healing or tearing down, destroying. I think one of the Proverbs I read is like stabbing. Like it's like words can actually be like a stab.
Yes, like a sword, piercing. Yeah, for sure. Absolutely.
Cool.
I got a question here. What would you say to someone who finds themselves trying to be a good listener all the time, but struggles with not feeling listened to? They don't feel like someone's listening to them, and so they're struggling with that. And I think that's certainly a tough situation. If someone's not really listening to you, you don't feel they're going beyond the surface of the conversation. And I think one of the things to do with that is just simply saying to the person, I'm feeling like I'm not being listened to, and it might be my fault. Can we talk about how to get to that point? And I think just opening up the dialogue that way, I think is one of the ways of making that happen. And being careful not to accuse, because that always sets up a barrier right away. You're trying to open it up.
Right. Yeah, that language of like, you never listen. And But I would add to what you said too is I feel like you're not listening to me, and that makes me feel like you don't care. And so you're basically saying like, tell me something. Like, are you trying to tell me that you don't care? Because that's how I feel. And keeping it with just, it's your feeling. It's not that you don't care. It's just, that's how I'm feeling.
Good point.
And a lot of people, when they hear that, will go, oh my goodness, that is not what I've been trying to communicate at all. And that can actually crack people open that have been quiet. Because they're like, well, if that's what I'm doing, I don't want to do that.
Yeah, and it's quite possible it's not just with you that I'm like this, where I'm not really being open or not listening, but maybe with other people as well. So this is a great growing point. I always want, one of the things I say frequently to myself is, I don't want to get to the end of my life and found out I had this dumb thing that I kept doing year
Yeah,
after
yeah,
year
yeah.
after year, and nobody had the guts to say to me, Ken, did you
Yeah.
not know you were like this? Like,
Yeah.
I want to know now. I mean,
Yeah.
do it in a gentle way, but everybody wants to be better, right? And I
Yeah.
think that's important for us to sometimes deal with the hard stuff.
Yep, that's a good posture.
Yeah.
Well, we're just about out of time, so I'm going to pray to close off this part of the morning. And thanks so much for joining us. So would you join us in prayer as we close? God, I want to pray for the families right now and the people that are struggling with the pandemic. There's been new lockdowns, and the kids aren't going back to school like we thought they would tomorrow, and so there's new pressure on families and kids and parents. And we need you. We need your strength right now. And so would you bring us your strength by the power of your Spirit? God, would you help us to communicate with the people that are in our networks? And if we're hurting or we're finding this really difficult, would you help us to find the people that can care for us? And God, may people know that the church is here, that we're still here. That's part of why we do this live thing, is we want people to know that we are still reachable, and
Yes.
we want to help if we can. And so, God, we just pray for our family, for the church body, and for everybody in the KW region right now. And God, would you help us to become better communicators? Help us to be more intentional with our words. Help us to become better listeners, and help us to be more vulnerable so that we can experience what it means to love and be loved.
Yes.
And Jesus, we ask for these things by the power of your Spirit, and we pray for them in your name. Amen.
Amen.
Grace and
God
peace.
bless.